Yeah, so it can. I can go live now. Yeah.
Cool. Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for coming to the first iteration of the Node New Economy series. We have here today Boris and Steve, and we're here to talk about Mimblewimble and its two implementations, Beam and Grin. So I want to first start off with both of our panelists today. I'd love to hear more about your background and how you first heard about Mimblewimble.
Yeah, so my background, it's crazy like everybody else in crypto. I'm a video game designer by trade. I basically did a lot of gaming stuff back in like 2005. I helped launch a game called Maple Story a really long time ago, which my job over there at Nexon was to kind of focus on the secondary virtual markets. So at that time I started learning about how addictive virtual currencies are when people were paying $7 to $8 per million of this in-game currency, which was quite interesting. From there, eventually I got into the virtual reality industry, AR, which is a frontier technology, and a buddy of mine was recommending like, hey, you should really look into blockchain because there's a lot of intersect between these, and I started really deep diving into the blockchain industry about 2 years ago, and we started trying to do a project called MAP, which actually my partner at that time spoke here at Node a while ago, and yeah, well, the whole boom bust of the ICO scene and all that kind of stuff, things didn't really pan out, but during that time I had a friend say, hey, look, you got to really look at this Mimblewimble paper. It's quite interesting, and as I took a look into this thing, I was like, oh wow, like this is different. This is different than everything else. Like I was, after especially learning about this whole ICO scene, really deep diving into it, this Mimblewimble white paper and also the implementation Grin was such a breath of fresh air. I decided to really just drop my bags and just go like, hey, I want to work on that thing. This thing looks really interesting.
Breath of fresh air.
Because I think, and it's another thing too why I think a lot of the original Bitcoiners are kind of warm to Grin, is that, again, it's not so much about this whole, like, we can make money, let's flip this thing. Instead, it's really about like, hey, we figured out something really cool, and, who wants to work on this with us? And, I've definitely been more on kind of like community building and like really just kind of working together with other people to try to make something cool. And this had that vibe. I go into the Gitter, I go into the Telegram chat, and everyone's not saying like when moon, but when build, when release, and how can I help, and what can I do? The FluNet's not working, and etc. And it's just like, wow, people are actually talking about real stuff. And that's so different than all the other, ICO channels I studied and I went into. And, I was like, I think this thing's real. And that was about maybe 8 months ago. And I started to tell other people about it. Like, hey, you got to check out this thing. It's really cool. It solves kind of like a couple of things about Bitcoin that doesn't really have,
What's it solve?
Well, basically, what it does is it's able to prove double spend. To prove that there is no double spend by dropping. It's able to prove no double spend using cryptology without needing to have a publicly available ledger, and also that there's no addresses on it, so you can still maintain kind of your privacy on this whole thing while still being able to do transfers. And I think that's pretty big. Especially in the elegant solution that they have. I'm not a mathematician. I'm not I do program a bit, but I'm not like the best programmer out there or anything like that. But what it promised was something that I feel is at least a step in the right direction compared to what everybody else is saying, which is like, we have this thing, but there's just faster transactions, or we have this thing, but it's doing this. This thing was like, we're just actually taking something away. And I think that was such an elegant solution that they kind of presented during the Mimblewimble white paper, and the Grin team just popped out of nowhere, and now there's like 110 devs or something like that, just actively submitting and contributing to this thing. and yeah, I'm happy to be a part of this ecosystem as well, in what we're doing. So yeah.
Cool. Forrest, how do you learn about Mimblewimble?
Yeah, I guess to give background on myself, I've been really around computers my whole life. I started doing web development when I was around in middle school. I was building websites, putting advertisements on them, providing different softwares. And then around 2011 on Reddit, I came across the Bitcoin white paper. I thought it was something really interesting, but I didn't really have enough of a technological background to really grasp the technology.
How old were you when that?
So I was 12 at the time. And then 2013 came around, the prices started to pick up a little bit, and I got really interested in mining, but I didn't have the capital to set up my own operation, so I just purchased cloud mining contracts that I used. And I mean, it turns out that if I had purchased the coin outright, that would have been a lot more profitable than the mining, which is oftentimes the case. So then I let those run. It didn't really revisit it too much, and then after Ethereum came out, I missed the ICO, but I started to grasp like the concept of launching new tokens, doing ICOs and all that. So then I started investing in ICOs. I did about 30 to 40 different ICOs over the past 2 years, really all across the space. I really enjoyed like more foundational top technology than anything. And during that time, I came across an auction called the Ethereum Name Service, or the ENS, which is essentially domain names for Ether addresses. You can assign human readable text to Ethereum addresses. So I thought this would be like sort of like the next type of domain name, that businesses would be able to use this, create subdomains for their clients, and it would just make the whole process more efficient. So I started acquiring ENS names, and out of that, there were no immediate use cases out of it. So I thought, how can I, in a way, help the community and help the adoption of this technology? So I created a startup that I called Fourier Solutions. That was a point-of-sale system for Ethereum. So essentially, it was an iPad and a stand for any retail business to accept Ethereum. I was able to process the transactions within 2 seconds at fees that greatly undercut credit cards. I was doing this in Chicago at the time. I was in undergrad at Northwestern. It turned out that the venture capital market in Chicago is not very adept for crypto at all. So I came across the struggle that I couldn't really raise capital for the project, but I still thought it was something interesting. So I ended up putting it on hold and looking for other opportunities. And at the same time, through all this, I was still interested in investing and really assessing different crypto assets. So I had the idea of possibly joining a fund, and then during that time, I was actually at a conference. It was distributed, ran by BTC Media in Chicago, and I met Jeremy Gardner, who at the time was announcing his new fund, Awesome Ventures, and so I ended up interning for him that summer, and then came on full time as head of research. So I've been with Awesome for a little under a year now. I lead the due diligence process, and Awesome Ventures is a social impact focused blockchain fund. So we focus on anything from foundational technology, financial inclusion, privacy, really anything that we think at scale will impact 10 million people or more in a positive sense.
So how do you hear about Mimblewimble?
Oh yeah, so about Mimblewimble. So I'd say back in October, I saw in a lot of my investor groups, people were talking about Grin. And so I had no idea what it was, so I started to research it. And I'd always been a fan of Monero and ring signatures, and less so Zcash, but I still thought it was really interesting. So I went ahead and read the white paper, and I was really taken aback by it. So while I was at Northwestern, I was studying math and economics. So I had studied a lot of like the elliptic curve cryptography in my math studies, and so like the idea of using ECC for Mimblewimble was something that I resorted with, and that I
What's ECC?
So ECC is elliptic curve cryptography. It's essentially the idea that if you have like an elliptic curve, you can input different like scalar functions or different multiples of it, and you should be able to be still on the curve after those functions are completed. So I thought that was pretty compelling. Then the two projects that came out were.
And what do you think of the implication of elliptic curve cryptography?
Yeah, so it hasn't really been too much experimented with, I'd say, until Mimblewimble.
Yeah.
So I thought that like we've seen all these other forms of cryptography, and this is like a new place that mathematically is proven to be secure, but no one has implemented it yet. So that sort of like sparked an interest in me to explore it further.
Yeah, and I think for me and a lot of our in the community, it basically allows for scalability in ways that weren't really possible before with our understanding of cryptography, which I think we're also excited about Mimblewimble and its different implementations. So Forrest here is wearing a Grin t-shirt. Steve is very active in the Grin community in every sense. I definitely, I think both of you guys are invested in Grin, right? Me and our fund, we're not invested in Grin. We very much believe in Mimblewimble, but there's two major implementations of it. One is, I'm going to do my best to kind of summarize this and kind of correct me as things go or add. There's one kind of more open source implementation that happened very soon after the white paper came out, and then there's one more kind of startup implementation, and there's a few kind of key differences between them. The main one being that Beam, their team felt that in order to incentivize development and adoption, it was best to take 20% of the mining rewards and give those to early investors like our fund, founding team, developers, and to go to kind of a marketing and adoption budget, where Grin took kind of a purely open source approach. There's no team, there's no company, there's no legal entity. So in that respect, it kind of is more like Bitcoin, or at least the original implementation of Bitcoin, it's less like Bitcoin in terms of its emission schedule. So Beam took kind of more of a store of value approach, where there's going to be inflation to start, but then over time the inflation becomes very small, where Beam is going to have constant emission, so fairly high inflation over the long term and very high inflation in the short term. Beam is working, I think, on more usability aspects and has been more successful in a much shorter period of time. So better UI to UX on the existing wallet. Opt-in auditability. So these are both private tokens, but Beam wants to have adoption for businesses that want to be completely compliant with their local regulations. So they have the ability to basically turn on the view key for a specific auditor or regulator without compromising the privacy or security of anyone beforehand or anyone after that they send Beam to. A few other differences include the programming language. So with Beam, it's known standard C++, and with Grin, it's Rust. There's different hashing algorithms. So Beam chose the echo-hash algorithm that is used to mine Bitcoin and many other proof-of-work cryptocurrencies. Grin chose to use the cuckoo cycle, new hashing algorithm. Neither Grin started as trying to be ASIC resistant, and I think now is kind of given up on that. Is that or?
Yeah. So I think if anybody's learned anything from Grin, it's don't be ASIC resistant. There's just no point.
Yeah.
If there's a way to make money, people will. So yeah, there's already a couple ASICs coming out for Grin. One is the Obelisk 1, which is supposed to release in a couple months for something like $4,000 to $6,000, and it should provide about 10 to 15x compared to a GPU. And then there's another one actually I've heard of that's actually in China. I don't know the name of it, but it's already operational.
Cool.
From what I've heard, yeah.
I mean, to add to that, what I read about Grin was that the plan is to do, I guess, GPU mining in the beginning and then slowly add ASICs to the network, which is an interesting approach because GPU miners are traditionally just individuals with computers like mining on their own, versus ASICs are the large mining farms. So it really fosters a community early on.
So that's the plan. That's the plan now.
Yes,
Yeah.
I don't know if it's changed.
That was the plan. Unfortunately, the plan didn't go to plan. There was too many SPVs set up, and day one the difficulty spiked to something like 1.2 million. Like 100 million or so. I don't know. Like right now, it's impossible to mine from home now. There's too many players out there that have, and it's actually really bad timing because of the entire Ethereum fork or whatever the update caused all the GPU miners to have to point to something.
Yeah.
So they've all pointed at Grin and Beam, and because of that, it's just completely, it's don't bother mining Grin at home. You're gonna lose. There's just no way for you to make money on it right now. If you were mining for money, for sure. Yeah.
This is coming from someone who is perhaps one of
There is no UI for Grin. There's no team. And Beam again, I think Beam or any implementations. I'm not a great maximalist or anything like that. It's a bunch of people that got together, and as I said, so one of the that's what we're basically releasing a cross-platform Windows wallet with a built-in decentralized message that has end-to-end encryption, can facilitate transfers. Long story short, we're making Grin usable from the common person. Beam had that day one rollout,
Do you feel like Grin will ever be able to kind of be at a similar level to Beam based on just the different?
I don't think those projects are similar in any way, in the sense of what the is. I think Beam again is taking more of an Ethereum approach. I think people have said, but essentially, there's a team, and they're clearly there. Their incentive for building this thing is for profit. I believe that the Beam team.
I would stop you there. That's definitely not.
I mean, people work for a reason.
For sure.
Yeah. If they were building something, taking no salary, and strictly creating like a foundation where they literally took no salary, then I would agree.
So do you think you're not able to believe in something that isn't making money while making money doing it?
It doesn't. That's not what I'm really trying to say though. Is that no matter what, if you are taking money out of a project, there is some incentive there that I want to, receive some value out of the work I've put in. It's not so much like where, for I made a music soundtrack. Creative Commons. That thing went viral. It's sitting on like 400, 500 million views. I haven't seen $1 whatsoever. Even though I've been powered, I was like the stock soundtrack of, but I haven't seen a single dollar from that. At all. And you can't say that I'm in it for the money, because literally I haven't received $1 from it. People have offered. And then again, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it, receiving money. There's really important.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that, on Beam, this is their main job, so it is paying. But Grin is muscle.
What I was taking issue with was you saying it's a very different ethos, where it's fundamentally the same ethos as someone who knows the team very well. It's like the reason they're working so much on Beam and Mimblewimble is because they care about privacy and scalability of cryptocurrencies, and they're just taking a different approach in terms of saying, instead of trying to get the community to fund stuff or relying on motivated, that these things that we feel like we.
Then I think I shouldn't have used the word ethos.
Yeah.
Perhaps I should have said different funding mechanism, if that helps alleviate this.
Well, I think it's very different though. That's not semantic though.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think fundamentally there's a difference there, and I don't really think it's a deal breaker for anybody. Again, I have no problem with the Beam team at all. I think what they're doing is great. I actually, if it wasn't for Beam, I probably wouldn't be as familiar with Grin. That was in part because they had to research process. So I have no problem with Beam at all. It's just more that I do think that Grin is again somebody's side hustle versus Beam being a company, right? And if you're forming a corporation or anything like that, then you need to make sure that the corporation survives. While with Grin, it's kind of like, okay, well, who wants to take the torch now? And it's kind of like anyone can join in.
So it's starting as kind of a more centralized startup company, and then fairly soon going to transition to a foundation. And then after 5 years, there's going to be no treasury rewards and no kind of cut that goes. So the long-term vision is this open source, decentralized governance mechanism. It's like how to get to there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, absolutely. I have no qualms about that whatsoever. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I will say one thing though is that I actually wonder about the adoption of Beam versus Grin. So I was talking to a couple of lawyers and some lawyers that used to work at the SEC and things, and when we're talking about OTC, about Grin and the adoption of it, they said that absolutely 100% Grin is not a security. It can't be because there's no team, and because of that, it's just magic numbers in the sky, and I don't know if that applies to Beam. So, because I think Beam can be considered a security, as there is a team and there is a mining incentive to that. So I'm not sure.
So that's a good question. So the investment vehicle that we invested through, which is basically getting a wallet that is hard encoded into the Genesis block, that approximately every month for 5 years, any of the early investors are going to receive Beam. That wallet and that process is security, so you have to be an accredited investor or entity to do that. But the actual currency itself is not a security, and that's been, at least to my understanding, there hasn't really been any legal opinion otherwise on that.
I mean, and to add to that, I know Beam is registered as a non-profit in Switzerland, so I don't know how that would change with the security regulation, but I'm inclined to believe that would be less likely to classify as a security.
Yeah, they've done significant